Experienced and dedicated fighters, Edson's first raiders were the toughest American troops in the Pacific. They were all volunteers chosen from the ranks of a force known for its fighting qualities. The raider concept had come from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for creation of a commando force, and Carlson's experience had included a service tour of several months with the Chinese Communist Eighth Route Army in its guerrilla struggles against the Japanese in North China. Edson's raiders had trained for many months under Spartan conditions, and when they came to Guadalcanal, they already had a powerful reputation. As it turned out, they would need every trick they had learned, and would learn some new ones. This invasion was the first contact between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans. Since the war had begun in December, the Japanese had a reputation even more fearsome than that of the raider battalions gained through the phenomenally rapid march of their forces through the Philippines, Malaya, the East Indies. For months Tokyo had crowed over its victories, and half the world had come to believe the Japanese were invincible. A reputation the Imperial High Command was pleased to encourage. Chilagi, then, was in a sense the first testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern part of the island, and at the beginning the going did not seem much harder than it was on Guadalcanal. They encountered some resistance from a few outposts. The northwest part of Tagi was covered with thick jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea with its beautiful leaves and sharp thorns. At first the terrain seemed to be the worst obstacle. Edson lost only one man, and that one to a sniper, as the Marines hit the beach. Edson planned to move inland to a ridge that ran the length of the island, and then work along the top of that ridge, clearing the slopes as they moved south. But the terrain was so difficult that it took 3 hours for the men to chop their way along a 1.5 miles of rising ground. Having reached the ridge line, the Marines moved ahead, came out of the jungle, and ran straight into the central Japanese defenses built on the hillside. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock embrasures, and had placed their machine guns carefully to create interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese defense was based on keeping the enemy below them, but the Marine found that by crawling up the cliffs, they could drop charges of dynamite and grenades into the dugouts, and that was the method they had to use to advance. Once dugout was blown, it still was not safe. In one hole the Americans killed 17 Japanese with dynamite charges. One Marine spotted a radio inside and went in to retrieve it. There were still 2 Japanese soldiers alive, and they shot him and another man who came after him before they were killed. One section of Marines took on this defense position in the center of the island, while the center and left flank of Edson's force pushed down the ridge. But even along the ridge line, the going was not easy. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. The frontal resistance was stiff, but with the Japanese frontal resistance was only half the battle. Snipers seemed to be everywhere, tied in trees and the tops of buildings behind rocks. A favorite tactic of the snipers was to let the forward element of a Marine unit pass, and then begin shooting at the men from behind. This move almost always meant death for the sniper, but usually not before he had caused several casualties. And one thing the first raiders learned that day was that the small 25 caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun slug were more apt to wound than to kill, which from the Japanese point of view was satisfactory, since it took additional troops and resources to care for the wounded. During the afternoon, the raiders drove along the ridge, and until they ran into a 3-sided ravine, whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls and established the fields of fire that would become so familiar in later months. As the Marines moved up, they ran into crossfire, and Edson stopped because darkness was coming, and this was no time to be probing unknown dangers. That night the Marines on Chilagi had another new experience. The Japanese, knowing they were outnumbered with no chance of survival, staged one of the desperate counterattacks for which they would become infamous. They waited until the Marine perimeter was quiet. Then, at 10:30 a.m., they broke through between 2 companies and surrounded one of them. The Marines fought in their foxholes and in the open, using guns, machine guns, grenades, and knives. The Japanese came along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post and reached a point 50 yards from him. Finally, the Marines overpowered the Japanese and threw them back, But not before one company had lost half its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8th, more troops were landed on Chilagi, until there were 500 on that side of Sear Channel. Edson's raiders and men of the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines began moving again toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one they attacked the Dugin machine gun positions on the steep sides of the old cricket ground. From one cave they removed 35 dead Japanese, some of them already rotting and stinking, but some killed in the last moment of defense of the position. From this, the Americans deduced properly that the Japanese tactic was to hold position until the last unless ordered to retreat. Proof of the discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Those troops who surrendered on Guadalcanal were mostly members of labor battalions, not combat troops. The raiders that second day encountered dozens of examples of a spirit they had not seen before. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers, who at the end had only one loaded pistol among them. As the Marines were ready to make the final assault, they heard 3 shots when they entered the dugout. They discovered 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then shot his 2 companions and himself in those first days. This suicidal attitude surprised the Marines. It was hard for an American to understand how cornered or wounded men, with no hope of survival in their whole, knowing that the enemy had an material and numerical advantage, would almost invariably choose death to surrender. It took some getting used to, but after a few Japanese had pretended to surrender only to pull out guns or bayonets to attack their captors, or to explode grenades to kill themselves and their enemies, the Marines took the Japanese on their own terms thereafter. There was virtually no further attempt to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. Chilagi was brought under control on that second day. Although not all the Japanese on the island had been killed, for days afterward Japanese snipers harassed the American troops until the last sniper was killed. One gets a feel for the stubbornness of the fighting on Chilagi in the experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. He had gone ahead of his men to attack a cave near the cricket field. The Japanese had fired sporadically from that position. He moved up close enough to throw hand grenades into the cave, and the Marines had been trained to pull the ring pin of the egg-shaped grenade throw count slowly. And here the explosion. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin through and counted on 6. The grenade was lobbed back out of the cave, and he had to duck to escape the blast of his own weapon. After another identical experience, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, then threw 4, 5, 6, and out it came again. Sergeant Goss called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite usually used to blow buildings. He thrust in the charge, primed it, and ran back a little. The Japanese thrust the charge out of the mouth of the cave. The dynamite exploded and drove a rock splinter into Goss's leg. The wound was not serious enough to faw him, but it hurt enough to infuriate him. He picked up his submachine gun and dashed into the cave, spraying fire. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers and counted 8 others who had died earlier. If possible, the fighting on Gavutu and Tano was worse than that on Chilagi. The landings there came in the middle of the morning. Not many troops were committed because no one expected to find many Japanese there. But since the seaplane base was on these islands, the Japanese had fortified them, and the Marines ran into trouble. The Japanese were surprised and had still not recovered from the bombardment and aerial attack that had destroyed their seaplanes, so the first troops ashore were met by rifle fire only. But when the second wave of Marines reached the beach the Japanese had organized about 500 yards back, and the fire was intense, the third wave came under fire before the landing craft reached shore, and the casualties were heavy. Gavutu and Tan Mogo were both dominated by small hills not quite 150 ft high, but above the sea level landings. This height was enough. The Japanese had built their defenses along the slopes, and they were well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. As on Chilagi, each Japanese position had to be taken. They did not retreat, and the viciousness of the fighting on Tan Amogo was almost unbelievable in the early waves. The Marines had landed tanks. The Japanese had come surging toward the Tanu dock, where the landings had been made. They had jammed crowbars under the treads, thrown grenades, and tried to set the tanks afire with rags soaked in gasoline. One tank commander had opened the hatch, and employed the tank's machine gun to kill 23 Japanese soldiers before one scram bled up the side of the tank, and stabbed him to death with a bayonet another Japanese, then threw gasoline-soaked rags inside the tank, and it burned by mid-afternoon on this first day. It was apparent that the Marines could use reinforcements, and a unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island where there were no Japanese was called over to assist. Tan Amogo had been taken, but the Marines were unable to secure the coreway that linked the two small islands. The reinforcements were ordered to Tan Amogo, and at dusk were given 5 minutes of preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unluckily, one of the last shells hit a fuel dump near the beach and lit up the shore as if it were noon as the Marines came up. The Japanese had them clearly silhouetted against the sea from the dugouts